I think about the day I started at Calloway Systems the same way I think about learning to drive. You don't remember every turn. You just remember that one morning you didn't know how, and then somewhere along the way, you did. That's how 23 years feels. You don't remember every Monday. You just remember that one September you walked in with a paper resume and a thermos of bad coffee, and then somewhere along the way, the place stopped being a job and started being something closer to a skeleton key. I knew where every wire ran. I knew which breaker tripped when the HVAC and the server rack ran simultaneously. I knew that the loading dock door needed to be lifted slightly before you pulled the latch, or it jammed, and I knew that nobody else knew that, and I never thought to write it down. My name is Nolan Firth. I was 51 years old when they let me go. I'd been with the company since I was 28. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a dramatic person. I don't tell stories at dinner parties. I don't nurse grudges. I coached Little League for 11 years. I have a Labrador named Biscuit, and my idea of a wild Friday night is a cold IPA and whatever game is on. I am telling you this because what happened, what I did, is not the kind of thing you'd expect from someone like me. And that's exactly why it worked. Calloway Systems started as a two-man operation in a strip mall in Dayton, Ohio. When I joined, there were 9 employees and one shared bathroom that flooded if you flushed more than twice in an hour. The founders, a pair of brothers-in-law named Phil and Dennis, had built a mid-size logistics software company out of nothing. And what they needed in 1999 was not another developer or another salesperson. They needed someone who could keep the lights on. Literally. I came in as Facilities and Operations Coordinator, which is a title that sounds more organized than it is. In practice, it meant I handled the lease, the vendors, the utilities, the property management company, the building inspector, OSHA compliance, and anything else that had no obvious owner. When the copier jammed, I fixed it. When the parking lot flooded, I called the contractor and then supervised him, because I'd learned the hard way that if you didn't, he'd patch the wrong drain. When the city updated the fire suppression code in 2004, I was the one who spent 3 weekends reading the ordinance and pulling the permits. Phil used to say I was the connective tissue. Dennis used to say I was the guy who makes sure the building doesn't eat us. I thought those were compliments. I still do, actually. I just didn't understand at the time that connective tissue is the first thing a surgeon cuts away when he's trying to get to something he considers more important. The company grew. That's the short version. The longer version involves 2 acquisitions, a pivot away from legacy trucking software into supply chain, SaaS, and a complete turnover of leadership that happened so gradually I barely noticed it until I looked up one day and realized I didn't recognize anyone in the C-suite. Phil had cashed out in 2017. Dennis followed in 2019. The new CEO, a man I will call the executive, came from a firm in Chicago that specialized in taking mid-market companies and optimizing them, which is a word that usually means something different to the people doing the optimizing than it does to the people being optimized. The executive was 43. He wore slim-fit suits and talked about North Star metrics and headcount efficiency. He had an assistant who scheduled his bathroom breaks, I think. He'd walked through the building exactly twice in the 18 months he'd been there, and both times he'd looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're not sure you remember buying. I didn't take it personally. I'd outlasted 4 CEOs before him. I figured I'd outlast this one too. You ever spend 2 decades keeping a machine running and then walk into a room where everyone's arguing about the machine's brand identity and realize not a single person in that room knows how to turn it on? That was most of my last 3 years at Calloway. I sat in meetings about culture transformation and agile restructuring, and I nodded. And then I went back to my office and made sure the HVAC maintenance contract was renewed and the parking garage lighting was up to code and the quarterly lease payment was submitted before the 5th of the month, like it had been for 23 years. The lease. I need to tell you about the lease. When Phil and Dennis signed the original 10-year lease on the Calloway building in 1998, they were operating with a startup's budget and a startup's chaos. The property, A 24,000 square foot commercial building on Mercer Industrial Parkway was owned by a local real estate investment group. The lease was negotiated by Phil, reviewed by a part-time attorney, and then largely forgotten about by everyone except the property management company and me. Here's the part that matters. When the lease came up for its first renewal in 2008, Phil handled it. When it came up again in 2013, Dennis and Phil were in the middle of the first acquisition, and they handed it to me. Not officially. There was no memo. There was no updated job description. Phil just leaned into my office one Thursday afternoon and said, "Nolan, the Mercer lease renewal is coming up in April. You know this building better than anyone. Just handle it, will you?" And I said, "Sure." So I handled it. I negotiated with the property management company directly. I coordinated with the real estate investment group's attorney. I got a good rate, below market for that corridor actually, because I'd maintained the building so well that the ownership group preferred a stable tenant to a higher-paying unknown. I signed the paperwork because Phil had authorized me to, because he trusted me, because he was in Phoenix closing a deal and I was the person who knew what needed to happen and I made it happen. The name on the 2013 lease renewal as the authorized signatory for the tenant was mine. The 28 renewal followed the same pattern. Dennis was in the middle of the second acquisition. He asked me to handle it. I handled it. Same property group, same attorney on their side, slightly higher rate, still below comparable properties in the corridor. Signed, submitted, filed. The 2018 lease had a 5-year term, which meant it would expire in the spring of 2023. There was a renewal clause, 30 days written notice required from the tenant to exercise the option. That notice was due by February 1st, 2023. I was let go on January 17th. The meeting lasted 9 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch when I sat down and looked at it again when I stood up. The executive's HR director, a woman who had been with the company for 14 months, slid a folder across the conference table and told me that due to a strategic reorganization of operational functions, my position was being eliminated. There was a severance package, 8 weeks, which works out to roughly 4 days per year if you're keeping score, and a standard separation agreement that included a non-disparagement clause. The HR director thanked me for my service. She did not know my last name. I watched her check the folder to remind herself what it was. I signed the separation agreement that afternoon, not because I was a pushover, because I'd read it, and it didn't prohibit me from exercising any legal rights I already had. I've learned over 23 years of reading vendor contracts and lease agreements and OSHA compliance documents that you always read what you're signing. I drove home. I told my wife, Lorraine, what had happened. She cried. I didn't. Not that night. I grilled some chicken. I threw the ball for biscuit in the backyard until it was too dark to see, and then I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing down everything I could think of that Calloway Systems didn't know. The list was 4 pages long. At the top was the lease. I want to be careful here, because I've told this story to a few people, and there's always a moment where someone thinks I sat in my kitchen plotting revenge like a movie villain. That's not what happened. What happened is that I'm 51 years old, and I've spent 23 years managing operational details. And when your operational brain turns on, it turns on. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about loose ends. And the lease was the loosest end I'd ever left. I called my personal attorney, a man I'd known since our kids played soccer together in 2009, the next morning. I explained the situation. He got quiet in the way that attorneys get quiet when they're trying to not sound as interested as they are. He asked me to email him the lease documents. The 2018 lease was clear. The authorized signatory was me, acting on behalf of Calloway Systems. The property management company had me in their system as the primary contact. All correspondence since 2013, lease amendments, maintenance notifications, renewal reminders, had come to my email address and my office phone. There was nothing in the corporate records, as far as either of us could tell, that had ever updated the contact information or the signatory authorization. My attorney called the property management company on January 22nd. He identified himself, asked a few questions, and confirmed that as of that date the February 1st renewal notice had not been received. 5 days. Calloway Systems had 5 days to submit renewal notice for the building they'd occupied for 25 years, and not one person there knew the deadline existed. My attorney and I had a long conversation that afternoon. He outlined my options with the careful neutrality of someone who has been a lawyer long enough to know that the right answer and the satisfying answer are not always the same thing. At the end, he asked me what I wanted to do. I thought about the folder the HR director slid across the table. I thought about her checking my name. I thought about 8 weeks severance for 23 years. I thought about Phil telling me I was the connective tissue and then selling the company to a man who had looked at me like a piece of furniture. Let the deadline pass, I said, and then we talked to the property group about what happens next. February 1st came and went. No renewal notice from Calloway Systems. On February 6th, my attorney contacted the real estate investment group directly. He explained the situation, that the authorized signatory on the lease had been separated from the company, that no renewal notice had been submitted, and that under the terms of the lease, the option had lapsed. The ownership group was sympathetic. They'd dealt with me for a decade. They knew my name. They asked what we had in mind. What we had in mind was this: the property group would issue a formal notice of lease expiration to Calloway Systems, citing the lapsed renewal option, and provide a 60-day notice to vacate under the holdover provisions of the expired lease. The ownership group would retain full authority over the property. I would, as a separate matter, enter into an agreement to serve as a transition consultant to help identify a new tenant or assist in lease negotiation, a role that would compensate me at a rate that made my former annual salary look like a rounding error. It wasn't an eviction in the traditional sense. It was a property rights issue, cleanly and legally executed. But the effect was the same. Calloway Systems received the notice on February 9th. The executive called my cell phone at 7:14 in the morning on February 10th. I was in the middle of my second cup of coffee. Biscuit was asleep on the kitchen floor. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink the way it does in February, low and pale and honest. I looked at the caller ID. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. He didn't say good morning. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "Good morning." He said, "And I want to be precise here because this is the part I've thought about most." He said, "You need to fix this. Do you understand? You need to fix this immediately. We have 300 employees in that building and a client summit in 6 weeks, and you are going to fix this." I waited a beat. Not for dramatic effect. I just wanted to make sure he was finished. Then I said, "I no longer work for Calloway Systems. You may want to contact your legal team." He said something after that. I didn't really catch it. I told him I had to go, and I thanked him for calling, and I hung up. Lorraine was standing in the kitchen doorway with her coffee mug. She'd heard enough. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'm okay." She sat down across from me. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, "they figure out that the person who knew where everything was is the person they handed a cardboard box." What followed was not swift or cinematic. Real legal and property matters never are. Calloway Systems hired 2 outside attorneys within the week. There were letters. There were phone calls between counsel. There was an emergency board meeting that I know about secondhand, because one of the original facilities vendors, a guy I'd worked with for 15 years, texted me a blurry photo of the sign-in sheet from the lobby because he thought I'd want to know. The company's position was that I had acted beyond my authority in the 2018 lease signing. My attorney's position was that I had acted exactly as authorized, in writing, by the then COO, with supporting email correspondence, and that 23 years of consistent, unquestioned practice constituted implicit authorization recognized under Ohio agency law. Their attorneys knew, and my attorney knew that their attorneys knew, that this was not a fight they were likely to win in front of a judge. The ownership group was under no legal obligation to accommodate Calloway Systems. They had a clean expiration and a holdover clause and a building in a corridor that had gotten more valuable, not less, in the 5 years since the last lease was signed. They were also not unreasonable people. Nobody wanted to actually relocate 300 employees. What happened after 8 weeks of negotiation was this. Calloway Systems signed a new 5-year lease at current market rate, which was 31% higher than what they'd been paying. They paid the property group's legal fees, and they paid me, through my attorney as a consulting settlement, a lump sum that represented, roughly, what my 8-week severance would have looked like if it had been calculated at 4 weeks per year instead of 4 days. I'm not going to tell you the number, but I will tell you that Lorraine and I have been talking about that lake house in Michigan for 15 years, and we stopped talking about it in March because we started making calls. Here is what I want to say to anyone who has ever been handed a cardboard box. I don't think Calloway Systems was evil. I don't think the executive was a villain. I think he was a man optimizing metrics in an industry he didn't fully understand, and I was a line item that didn't show up clearly in his dashboard, and so he cut me. That is a very common and very human kind of blindness. Companies do it every day. They look at the org chart and they see a title that sounds like overhead, and they eliminate it, and then 6 months later, they're paying 3 people twice as much to do half as well what one person was doing invisibly. The invisible ones are not powerless. We are, in fact, the load-bearing walls. You just can't see us until you knock us out. I kept a toolbox in my truck for 23 years. Not because it was in my job description, it wasn't, not in any contract I ever signed. But because I was the person who showed up when things broke. I fixed things. I maintained things. I knew the building like I knew my own house, because in a real way it was. I poured myself into it the same way my father poured himself into his hardware store. Quietly, completely, without expecting a ceremony. They gave me 9 minutes and 8 weeks' pay. What they forgot, what I think most companies forget when they're doing their headcount efficiency calculations, is that institutional knowledge doesn't transfer in an offboarding checklist. It transfers in 10,000 small acts over 23 years. It lives in the contacts in your phone and the notes in your files, and the relationships you built with the people who own the building where your company lives. You can't download it. You can't onboard it. You can only lose it, and most of the time you don't find out what you lost until something breaks. My lease expired on February 1st. Calloway Systems didn't know it existed. That's not a revenge story. That's a maintenance report. I've been away from Calloway for 4 months now. I consult a little. I help small businesses with operational setup, lease reviews, vendor contracts, the kind of unglamorous infrastructure work that nobody wants to do until it goes wrong. I charge what I'm worth, which turns out to be considerably more than what the executive thought I was worth, and I have enough control over my schedule that I can take Biscuit to the park on Tuesday mornings when it's quiet. There's a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you did your job, not from the settlement, not from the lease, just from knowing that for 23 years the building ran, the systems worked, the deadlines were met, the lights stayed on. I did that. Nobody gave me a plaque for it. Nobody needed to. But I'll tell you this. The day the executive called my cell phone at 7:14 in the morning, his voice climbing toward something that wasn't quite panic but was getting there fast, that was the day I understood completely what I had been worth. I finished my coffee. I scratched Biscuit behind the ears. I watched the pale February light come through the kitchen window. Then I called my attorney and told him we were ready to negotiate. I thought a lot about what actually happened. Not the legal part, not the lease or the letters or the phone call at 7:14 in the morning, but the deeper mechanics of it. Why it unfolded the way it did. And I keep coming back to something simple. For 23 years I did the work nobody asked me to document, because I believed that doing it well was enough. That belief was not wrong. It just wasn't complete. The truth is, what protected me wasn't luck. It wasn't clever scheming. It was the accumulated weight of doing things right, consistently, over a very long time. Every lease I read carefully. Every deadline I tracked without being reminded. every vendor relationship I built with patience and straight dealing. None of that was strategy. It was just how I was raised to work. My father ran a hardware store for 31 years, and he never once cut a corner he didn't have to cut. He said the store would remember. I thought that was old man talk. I understand it now. There's a version of this story where I come out bitter, where I spend the rest of my life resenting the executive and the HR director who checked the folder to remember my name. I chose not to live in that version, and I want to be clear that it was a choice, not because I'm a saint, but because I recognized early on that bitterness is just grief that forgot to move forward. What I had instead was clarity. I knew what I'd built. I knew what I was worth. And when the moment came to demonstrate that, I didn't need to raise my voice. The document spoke. That's the thing about integrity over time. It compounds. Not in a way anyone can see on a spreadsheet, but in the way Lorraine can see it, and the way the property group could see it when my attorney called and they already knew my name on the other end of the line. 23 years of showing up and doing the unglamorous work creates a kind of quiet authority that no title can manufacture and no layoff can revoke. I think about the people who've reached out to me since I started talking about this. The IT workers, the operations managers, the people who've given 15 or 20 years to a company and been handed a cardboard box and a form letter. They all ask some version of the same question. How do you stay standing after something like that? And I don't have a tidy answer, but I have an honest one. You stay standing by knowing what you actually built, not just what your job title said you were. You stay standing by reading what you sign. You stay standing by treating every relationship with vendors, with property managers, with attorneys, with the guy at the county permit office, like it matters, because it does, and usually at a time you cannot predict. And you stay standing by understanding that the people who underestimate you are working with incomplete information. You are not obligated to correct them immediately. Nolan Firth didn't outmaneuver anyone. He just outlasted the assumption that invisible meant disposable. Those are different things, and the difference is everything. The lease expired on February 1st. Nobody at Calloway Systems knew it existed. That's not a revenge story. That's what happens when you spend 23 years paying attention.